We're bringing you boots on the ground insight from the ranchers, conservationists, and partners who are helping to preserve the best of the Golden State for generations to come. Join the California Rangeland Trust for inspiring stories of resilience, innovation, and hope as we get tuned into the land.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Tune Into the Land. I am your host and CEO of the Rangeland Trust, Michael Delbar. For generations, grazing has played an essential role in shaping and sustaining the landscapes of the American West. Thoughtfully managed livestock grazing supports healthy rangelands by reducing invasive species, managing fuel loads that contribute to catastrophic wildfire, and helping maintain open, working landscapes that support wildlife habitat and our rural communities. But this work doesn't happen only on private lands. Millions of acres of public lands across the West are grazed under federal permits, forming a critical link in the stewardship of the vast, interconnected ecosystems. These landscapes support biodiversity, watershed health, recreation, and local economies, and the ranchers who steward them play an essential role in keeping them resilient and productive. Unfortunately, grazing on public lands is often the center of policy debates and public misunderstanding. Questions about land health, conservation priorities, and access continue to shape these discussions. So today, we're pleased to bring you an expert on the subject. I'm pleased to be joined by Caitlin Glover, Executive Director of the Public Lands Council. Caitlin works at the intersection of ranching, public policy, and land stewardship, representing cattle and sheep producers who graze livestock on federal lands across the West. In this episode, we talk about the role of the Public Lands Council, the challenges ranchers face when grazing on public lands, opportunities within the federal grazing permits, and how producers are working to care for the land while supporting rural communities. We also explore common misconceptions about grazing and why producer voices are essential in shaping the future of public lands management. With that, it's my pleasure to bring you my conversation with Caitlin. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Caitlin Glover to the podcast. Good morning, Caitlin.
Good morning, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being part of this today. How are things in Washington, D.C.?
You know, as I look outside my window here in Washington, we're getting a little bit of rain, which is great, right? You know, I'm from Wyoming. All rain is good rain. Precipitation is always welcome. I wish I could ship it out to all of you. I know that has been a challenge for a lot of our friends in the West this year.
Well, actually, it is pouring down pretty well here in California right now. Interesting, yesterday I was at a grocery store doing some grocery, not my typical grocery store, by the way. But as I was standing in line at the checker, this lady was standing behind me and she looked at me and looked up and down and she said, "It's cold." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, it's a little cold, but not too bad. It's raining." And she said, "Yes, we don't need rain." And I said, "Yeah, actually we do." She goes, "Why, to take showers?" I said, "No, to grow food, ma'am, to grow food." "Oh, well, I guess we don't need too much rain." I said, "Well, ma'am, we do." "Oh, well, okay." And I thought, that's typical. Folks that just don't seem to understand the importance of what we all pray for all the time is good weather, whether that be sun or rain and snowpack and et cetera. So we're glad to have it. I'm going to be back there in D.C. next week, so hopefully it's moves on and the weather's nice next week when you get a chance to go back there and do some advocating. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who's Caitlin and how you got to where you are?
Sure. Well, you know, it's funny. We talk about rain, we talk about precipitation. I think anybody who raises food or fiber, you always start conversations with a weather status, a weather check. And that was pretty typical of my whole life. I've been, chasing rain, I think from the time, the time I can remember. I grew up in Wyoming. Where we don't get a lot of rain, we get some pretty decent snow. It's pretty cold. But decided that I wanted to continue working in agriculture, even though I wasn't going to go home to a farm or ranch, right? I ended up moving to Ireland. So truly chasing rain, literally and figuratively, right? After undergraduate, I went to Ireland. I ended up working and was a fellow for essentially their farm advisory service. Because in Ireland, unlike the U.S., in Ireland, the advisory service is linked to their Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine rather than their universities, like it is here in the land grant institutions. And so I was there for a couple years. Ultimately ended up coming back to Washington, D.C. I was here a couple times in college through various internships. So if there are any young people listening, this is my plug for internships. Internships are a great way to figure out what you do want to do, but also a great way to figure out what you don't want to do. For me, it was that I figured out that I really wanted to be involved in policy. That was sort of my space where I wanted to be in agriculture and natural resources. So a little more than a decade ago, I came back to D.C. I ended up working in the Senate for a member from my home state for quite a number of years, and then have been here at the Public Lands Council and it's one of its members, NCPA, for the last 6. So it's been hugely rewarding to continue to watch and be a part of the arc of discussion of policy in this space. And I always say, my former boss, who is from Wyoming, you ask him, how is he? How is everything? And he says, well, I'm not in Wyoming, and so I'm only as good as I can be, because it's always better in Wyoming. And I sort of feel the same way. I feel very privileged to be here in D.C. and do what we do, but it is always better in the West. So very thankful that I continue to work for producers across the country, but really in the Western U.S., who are so critical to the food discussion that you were talking about, but also fiber, food security, national security, natural resource security, and the management of those issues.
Senator Barrasso, you used to work for?
I did. Yeah, I worked for Senator Barrasso. I was very blessed to work for my home state. You say that you're going to come back to Washington here in a few weeks. We're going to have a Wyoming contingent back in a few weeks as well for our legislative conference, which is going to be great. But it always makes me nervous because I'm from a very windy part of the country. And when all those people come out from Wyoming and they spend some time here in Washington, I'm wondering who's holding the ground down because worried Wyoming might blow away.
Wyoming, D.C. is a long way from Wyoming, both figuratively and literally. How was that transition for you?
I'm asked that a lot, and it wasn't as much of a transition in the way that you would think. I mean, certainly, living in a place where there's more concrete than there is soil. Living in a place where there are so many people. I'm from Wyoming, and in Wyoming, we are very clear that there are both more cows than people, but also more antelope than people. But I think that the special part of living in Washington and working in the ag and natural resource space is that it's really community based. When you come from a small town or when you come from a rural economy, you know what it's like to know your partners. You have those relationships. You have those connections with people. And so I have really prioritized being here in the various neighborhoods where I've lived, but also in the professional space. I really prioritize building that same community on trust and mutual understanding for those mutual goals, right? Because if not, we're not alone in this world unless we choose to be. And I think that has been one of the biggest parts of the transition, is just making sure that you have a community no matter where you are. I will say, though, I drive into work every morning, and it takes me just about as long to get to work as it would take us to get into town when I was a kid. But the challenge here is that you get into a traffic jam, and so it's a much less pleasant drive in.
Right. Those antelope are pretty fast. They have the signs on the side of the roads and highways in Wyoming says 50 miles an hour or whatever. They say well, I've clocked them. They can do that. They're fast little boogers. Tell us about the Public Lands Council. Who does the council represent, and what's the relationship with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association?
So we've now reached my favorite subject, which is PLC. The Public Lands Council is an organization. It was started in 1968. And even though there are a lot of trade associations that represent, certain portions of an industry, right? We have a variety of advocacy groups. In the late 60s, cattle and sheep producers in the West came together because they knew that they were facing some pretty significant political headwinds that were unique to that part of the country. So the Public Lands Council represents cattle and sheep producers in the 14 Western states. where you have federal grazing permits. So where those ranchers have a relationship with the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. Some have cooperative agreements like with the Park Service or with the Bureau of Reclamation. But it really is that core group of ranchers who now manage about 250 million acres of land across the West. That's just the federal land, not including their base property, right? The 250 million acres, about 22,000 grazing permits. And that evolution over time has, what started, PLC started as an advocacy organization during the advent of concepts like the Federal Land Policy and Management Act and the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act, right? All of those things were happening at the same time. And so PLC came to life to be able to represent those ranchers' unique interest in those conversations. And over the last, more than 50 years, we've seen this conversation evolve to a highly regulatory, highly involved political process in these Western states. In a lot of parts of the country, the federal government might not touch an individual's life in a routine way. But for federal lands ranchers in the West who comply with all of these federal laws and have an active relationship with the federal agencies, it's a much closer relationship. And so we spend a lot of time working through some of those regulatory issues, those legislative issues, and making sure that while the federal government loves to have job security, right? We all do. The federal government's job security should be doing what they're tasked by Congress to do, not creating new jobs for themselves. And so over the last 50 some years, we've really spent a lot of time holding the line and defending against the long tendrils of federal intervention in people's daily lives in the West.
So you mentioned 250 million acres in the West that are federal lands, the BLM primarily and Forest Service. California has 38 million acres of grazing land, and it looks like 15 million acres of BLM Forest Service under permit. Now, maybe some of that 15 million isn't all classified as grazing land. I'm not sure there, but it does show a significant value to California ranchers when you look at such a high number and ranchers that are dependent on those federal lands as part of their operations.
No, that's right. And I mean, you look across. So I was just in California at a conference talking about rangelands nationwide, right? So we have and this classification fluxes, right? But you have about 770 million acres of rangelands, grasslands, and other, areas that would be suitable for grazing across the country. The federal government manages or owns about 40% of those acres, and then about 250 million acres of those are grazed. When you look at a state like California, you have to combine not only the grazing land private pasture that people think about, that's private land, people have a lot of autonomy about what to do with that land, but then all of the other areas that might not be classified as grazing acres, but are that open and available to grazing. We're seeing a lot of discussions about silvopasture, grazing in a forested environment. We're seeing a lot of conversations, especially in urban areas, about the combination of solar grazing, right? Putting cows or putting sheep in these solar areas to be able to knock down some of those forage banks that then turn into wildfire fuel, right? And I think those numbers really show you why it's important that for PLC, we think about our affiliate structure and our partnership structure. So PLC has affiliates in 14 Western states that are those direct producer and permittee representatives. But we also have 3 national partners, the American Sheep Industry Association, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and the Association of National Grasslands. And so ASI, NCBA, and ANG also represent those producers on a national scale that really have those primary concerns, their base property, their home property, their private land. And so, when we're thinking about how we're classifying grazing lands, or we're thinking about the regulatory burdens or the legislative burdens, things that people are dealing with every day, we work through our affiliate structure and we operate as a true council to make sure that we're representing, all of the grazed acres that are currently grazed and all of the other areas where grazing is such a great management tool. So the math is a little hard to do, I think, nationwide, but I have the best job in Washington because I'm able to activate the national sheep herd. I'm able to activate the entire national beef herd through our affiliates, even if they don't live or work in the West, because of that structure.
So what are some of the initiatives that PLC is taking on right now? What are some of those big priority issues?
So when you work on grazing issues or range land management issues in Washington, you're having a lot of the same conversations over time. You know, we have had a lot of anniversaries among our affiliates and our partners over the last several years. Some are hitting 100, some are hitting 150 years. And it gives us a really great opportunity to look back at history about what some of those initiatives have been. And it will not surprise you that we have been working on taxes, working on transportation, access to water, access to markets, and all of the details that go along with all of those things. The Public Lands Council, you look back over our more than 50-year history, and we see a lot of recurring issues, right? What keeps rangelands healthy? What are the barriers that we have to make sure that we have both access and the tools to manage these areas? And how can grazing be a more prominent tool? And so when this administration started, we had a great opportunity to work with the transition team and outline some of those regulatory burdens that have existed in some cases for a couple decades. Very early, we were able to work, and we continue to work with the Bureau of Land Management to roll back that public lands rule that would have that fundamentally changed the way BLM balances those multiple uses on federal land in a way that would have disadvantaged grazing, unfortunately. We've worked with the Forest Service to make some amendments to forest plans. With BLM, we're working really hard to help them get across the finish lines and updates to the grazing regulations, changes that have been much needed since the mid-90s, but we've not been able to move forward over the last several administrations. We're dealing regularly with things like inefficient federal management of the wild horse and burro program, right? We see herds that are 7 or 8 times over their allocated stocking rate, putting a lot of pressure on these rangelands. And I don't think that we can, have this conversation about PLC's work without talking about wildfire, right? Fire is, no pun intended, but a flashpoint in Congress. And we've not seen a lot of agreement over the last 5 or 10 years about how to sort of put a pin in and a wedge point into this cycle of catastrophic wildfire in a meaningful way. The last time we had comprehensive forest-related legislation was in 2018 or 2019. And so then for the last 8 years, we've been working to develop this larger legislative effort to direct the agencies and give them better tools and fire management strategies. PLC has been spending a lot of time on a bill called the Fix Our Forests Act, because not only does it have some conditions for tall tree fires that really do move quickly across canopies and turn into these catastrophic fires, but also it has a really significant set of expectations that, if passed, the agencies would have to implement targeted grazing in a more comprehensive way. Our work here at PLC is to, I think, transform both the public understanding and the government understanding of grazing, not just as a use of federal lands, but as a management tool, a meaningful management tool that you can apply in a pretty nimble way. And so while we have a lot of different bills, a lot of different regulations that are on our docket, we're really spending a lot of time figuring out, in every case, how can grazing be a better management tool, and how do we make sure that creates and enshrines other opportunities for producers to have certainty, to have access to these rangelands, and opportunities to work with the landscape as conditions might change across the West.
I know the late Congressman Doug LaMalfa was a big champion of the Fix Our Forests Act, and it's something that we've advocated for in support of as well.
We're really going to miss Representative LaMalfa. He was both a huge champion on forest and fire-related issues, but he was also a friend of us and a friend of PLC. When we think about champions in Washington, so many of them have stepped through leadership positions in the Congressional Western Caucus, and Doug was no exception. His role as chairman was incredibly helpful, especially at a time that has been really challenging for California. I mean, you've had wildfire issues, certainly forestry issues, some regulatory disagreements between the state and the feds. And I think most recently about wolves as well. For the first time, really in a couple generations, we're seeing those big impacts in California. PLC is working with producers on the ground to help navigate not only some depredation and some regulatory issues, but we couldn't do it without voices like Doug's and voices who were willing and able to say, this is my district, these are my people, this is the role of the federal government, and this is what we need from you. And it's crucial to have partners like that.
And he was very good at representing the ag industry, but also working across the aisle to get real results done. No, we will absolutely be missing him as well. We have one of our landowner partners in Central Coast is a base property to a permit that's not being used, and a former permit 2 years ago probably wasn't the best one for that property, but she owns this base property, and we're trying to get that permit open, because it'd be an integral part of her operation and she's taken the step to conserve her ranch, but this would allow her to really succeed more with her livestock operation. That effort, though, because Forest Service has not been doesn't have the resources to complete the NEPA process, has been the biggest challenge. Although the forest ranger would love to see that permit opened up for her, it's just the bureaucracy that's gotten in our way. What are some of those efforts that PLC is working on to help get these permits back in place, back opened?
So this is, I think, an ongoing priority for PLC as we see some of the transitions. It strikes me across the country in the next 15 or 20 years, we're going to see 70% of farming and ranching operations change hands, right? So this succession is one factor in the conversation, but you've identified the other part of the conversation about what we do, responsible management of these acres that have been identified on federal lands as suitable for grazing, right? So a couple things here. At the beginning of this administration and frankly, other administrations beforehand, we went to the landing team, we went to the agencies very early and said, look, one of the things that is uniquely the relationship and uniquely the role of the federal government, of these agencies, is to make sure that they are fulfilling their mission. And one part of that mission is that if these are lands that have identified as suitable for grazing, then the federal agency should not be the barrier in grazing those acres. And what I mean by that is that a number of allotments across the West, hundreds of allotments across the West, are vacant for one reason or another, whether it's an infrastructure issue, they got burned out. In some cases, frankly, the permittees maybe were not permittees in good standing, and so their permit was canceled. But even though somebody might not have an active permit on the area, doesn't mean that the nature or the suitability of the underlying allotment changes. And so over last year, we were working with BLM and Forest Service to have a cohesive strategy for identification of those allotments that are vacant for one reason or another, classification of the barriers of re-permitting those allotments. Is it possible to get somebody back on, or do we need new fence? Is it possible to get somebody back on, or do we have water issues? Are there conflict issues with wildlife? As in a post-COVID area, is there a massive change to recreation on the allotment? Pulling all of those factors together and figuring out what's available, what's possible, and what needs additional work. And so that work, in addition to figuring out how to restock some understock allotments, dealing with some infrastructure issues, dealing with some post-fire issues, a lot of different reasons why maybe the grazing program wasn't as effective as it should be. And that all culminated in the Grazing Action Plan. So last fall, the Department of the Interior and USDA, as part of a larger plan to fortify the beef industry, right? I'm sure that everybody is aware of that plan by now. But my favorite part of that plan from the PLC perspective is that grazing action plan. And that grazing action plan said, look, we're going to take these vacant allotments. We're going to do this inventory. And I think they were pretty much done with the inventory at that stage, but are going to move forward to restock those allotments or re-permit those allotments based on existing protocol. Michael, I think taking stock of where we are now, we know that the federal agencies have fewer employees than they did at this time last year. The administration went through a pretty significant, right sizing activity for a lot of these agencies. And we know that especially in the range program, that means that resources are going to be limited. That is why it's absolutely crucial. And we work through our affiliates to say, okay, we have our affiliate in California. The California Public Lands Council is helping us to identify those vacant allotments on the ground. But then, as the agency does the work, does the NEPA, makes that allotment more available, are there people like your friend, your partner, who are willing permittees to say, I can, I have the livestock, I have the proximity, I have the expertise, I would like this permit. And being able to work through those channels to get those allotments re-permitted is a huge feature of those conversations that we're having with the agency.
No, we appreciate that. I know that the council's worked really hard on this and particularly addressing the personnel shortfall in the agencies, whether it be Forest Service or BLM, which led you to an MOU recently, actually just signed 2 weeks ago in Nashville at CattleCon. So can you tell us a little bit about what that MOU does? What's the intent of that?
I'd love to talk about the MOU. So for a number of years, PLC has been working with both the BLM and Forest Service on this concept of cooperative monitoring. In FLTMA, in the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and in the regulations that govern BLM and Forest Service, the agencies are responsible for making sure that permittees are permittees in good standing, right? That these people are taking care of the allotments for the benefit of the American people, and that management continues to match the needs on the ground. I think the reality is that the ranchers are the ones, the permittees are the ones who are on the ground, who are looking at utilization, how much their livestock are grazing. They're watching for potential conflicts. They're on the ground identifying potential fire risks or emergence of new invasive species. And they're doing this monitoring in a way that informs their management and their business decisions, but isn't always happening at the same time as the federal agencies. We talked a little bit about capacity, right? And, when we're thinking about all of the other things that agencies have to do in a given year, we recognize that it is going to be incredibly challenging for the agencies to do the kind of active monitoring in a timely way that is representative of rangeland health and can help them make management decisions as the agency. And so we signed the MOU with the Forest Service in 2022. We signed this new MOU with the BLM here just earlier this year in 2026. And what the MOU does is say, look, we have these permittees on the ground. These permittees are going to go through the training for appropriate monitoring methods for the BLM and Forest Service. And if the permittees are using an appropriate method, an agreed upon method, and it's signed off by their agency partner, the permittee can collect that rangeland monitoring data. They can submit that data to the Forest Service or the BLM respectively. And the agency is able to accept that data as if the agency had collected it itself. So that does a couple things. One, it gives the agency more data points, more information to be able to make better, more responsive decisions with their permittee partners. But it also puts permittees in the driver's seat, being able to have the confidence that the work that they're doing and the data that they're gathering is going to count for something. Because all of this data, all of this rangeland management information is crucial when it comes time to permit renewal, when it comes time to maybe see about having more adaptive management to mitigate fire risk or whatever it is. This data has to be used to be able to inform management decisions. And I think in this case, across these 250 million acres, more information is better, right? And so this creates and continues to enshrine the relationship between permittees and the agencies, so that this, for the benefit of rangeland health.
You mentioned the renewal of permits. Tell us a little bit about the structure of the permit process. How long are permits, the base property that's attached to them? Give us a little more background on how those permits work and how ranchers can take advantage of those opportunities.
Sure. So federal lands grazing permits are validated in a few different ways. A number of years ago, a couple decades ago, BLM and Forest Service went through the process to look at their holdings and identify which acres were suitable for grazing. At that time, then they created allotments, those areas that could be permitted. And those allotments are relatively fixed, right? Your pasture is going to be a pasture, but then the permit, the ability to access, the means by which to access those allotments is what changes hands over time. Those permittees go through a couple different processes depending on where they are in the country and which agency they go through. But essentially, they can apply for or bid for an allotment if it comes open. And if they are successful in getting that permit, they can hold that permit for a period of up to 10 years under the federal law. Now, in order to get to a point where an allotment can be permitted, it's not just that the area is available and suitable for grazing, but it goes through an ongoing NEPA and monitoring process to be able to make sure that the grazing that's authorized on the ground in that permit is still good for the land. And so every time you come up for renewal on that 10-year permit, you have to go through an evaluation. You look at least the last 10 years to make sure that that permittee is a permittee in good standing and is eligible for a renewal or an extension of that permit. And so you have active NEPA on these allotments, the environmental analysis. You have active touch points every single year between the Forest Service or the BLM and the permittee. And that management is ongoing. For new entrants, it looks a little bit different because some of these permits have been held for quite some time. And if a rancher buys a new ranch or buys a new base property, sometimes the permit can come with that ranch and they become the new permittee. But for a new permittee, going in and having a relationship with the BLM or Forest Service and having a conversation about their situation is the best way to start. Every permit requires some sort of base property. For the vast majority of BLM and Forest Service holdings, that is a portion of land that can feed or house their livestock for a certain portion of the year. Both BLM and Forest Service require both agencies require that a rancher have some sort of means to house their livestock off of federal lands at some point during the year. The permit conditions dictate how long that is, but base property, you have to have some sort of place to put that livestock in any given time. In the South, because base property is a little bit less important, you have a management change because of the way the ground looks, right? You get less rain, you have less precipitation in the South. And so some of the permits in southern Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico are water-based permits that a producer has to hold a water right in order to be able to water those livestock for a given period. At the bottom line, right, every permittee needs to have some sort of base property or water to tie a permit to. They need to have enough livestock to validate that permit to be able to say, I know that I have this amount of grazing and I'm permitted for this amount of grazing. I have enough livestock to be able to validate a significant portion of that grazing and use that in any given year. And I have the ability to be a permittee in good standing, maintain the water, maintain the infrastructure, maintain my responsibilities on that allotment. And then that's how you continue to hold this permit over time. But it is important to note that, at every 10-year period, the agency can reconsider whether to reissue that permit or not. The agencies provide a little bit, and the regulations provide a little bit of certainty in that space, where it's called a preference position or a preference right, depending on the agency. so that if you're a permittee in good standing, you get to be first in line for the next 10-year process, unless you've done something wrong or egregious, right? So it's a little bit of certainty at the end of that process. But I think anybody who has livestock or natural resources or kids, right, knows that 10 years is not a really long time. And so while it is good that you have some protection and some assurance that you will be at least first in line and are likely to receive a new permit, it's certainly not a guaranteed process. I think, the considerations I hear a lot, or the concerns I hear a lot about federal grazing permits from permittees, is that it's a relatively short period of time. It's very expensive to run on federal grazing allotments. PLC did some analysis a few years ago to be able to answer questions about whether it's more expensive to graze on, like private leased pasture versus federal lands. And in the vast majority of cases, it is as expensive or more expensive to graze on federal lands because of compliance costs, because of management costs, infrastructure requirements, and meeting all of those regulatory burdens. So not only do permittees have to have private land and water, not only do they have to have the livestock, they have to go further and probably truck livestock into some of these places. They also face greater uncertainty and greater costs as part of this process.
Well, in full disclosure, our family are public lands ranchers as well. And I can tell you the ratio of land from the private side to the public, to the forest permit, is 6-1. At least, if not closer to 7-1. And the road infrastructure in our public lands aren't what they used to be. The money hasn't been there. The road maintenance hasn't been there. And there's frankly an attitude, years ago of let's let roads go to pot and make them unpassable, because then we don't have to maintain them, and we have less issues. And there's been that roadless attitude. So it makes it hard to manage cattle, livestock in land where you have to get there by horseback. And you can ride for 2 hours, 3 hours and not find any animals, and you ride 2 or 3 hours back. And that's a day's worth of work and wear and tear on your horses and your vehicles, where you can do that in a matter of an hour on the private land and know what you're getting. So there is a huge cost differential between the two. And when you talked about the other benefits that the rancher provides in those permits, expand on that a little bit, because I don't think a lot of folks understand that, one, these are seasonal permits. Those livestock aren't out there 12 months a year. They're out there for a shorter period of time. But while they're out there, that land, that rancher is doing infrastructure improvements, clearing trails, water development. There's a bigger benefit to the public than just those cattle running out there. Talk, if you can, a little bit about those other responsibilities that the rancher has on those public lands for the benefit of everyone.
So I think it's important to remember that public lands exist in this country because as we went through westward expansion, we saw a lot of homesteading through the Homestead Act or through the Desert Lands Act. We saw a lot of homesteading around places that had water, places that could be farmed, and places that were highly fertile, right? And so as states went through the statehood process, all of these lands that were rocky and were dry and were harder to manage, or just more complex to manage, they became federal lands and they became state lands. And I'm way oversimplifying here, but when we think about public lands, often, the general discourse now is that these lands are just pristine and are just some of the most special places in this country, and they're just so highly productive. But that value and that concept of them being special has evolved over time because what we needed from the land changed. In the beginning, we needed to be able to provide food, we needed to be able to have access to water, and we needed some, concentrated grazing, like for livestock, right? And the public lands ranching sort of arc over time has put a lot of that onus and that cost back on the rancher, who, as a condition of their permit, has to maintain fences, has to maintain water infrastructure, is responsible for a lot of those things that we call minor range improvements, right? But making sure that they're seeding or doing approved seeding or weed treatments, right? Making sure that other infrastructure that exists on the allotment is maintained, while also navigating the multiple use mandate, which is other uses can exist on that allotment and shouldn't be in conflict, right? Things like recreation, things like energy, forestry or timber production. And certainly those wildlife benefits are huge when we're thinking about the rancher's portfolio. We're talking, I think if we're putting some numbers on it, right? For the multiple use and for some of those associated benefits, ranchers are generating almost $9 billion every year, give or take, from federal lands in terms of ecosystem services. That's in addition to the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're generating in direct revenue from the BLM and Forest Service grazing program, above and beyond what they're actually generating from food and fiber, right? So your beef, your lamb, your wool. So the economic and environmental contributions that we're seeing coming from this segment of the industry is huge. And then you layer that on top of all of the different wildlife pieces, because people love to hunt, people love to go watch elk, go find those really special wildlife that they might not have in that part of the country. And you start to see that value assessment really sort of ratchet up. Ranchers are one of, there are a few uses that pay for the privilege to manage these federal lands. Timber obviously is one of them, but grazing is the other. Ranchers pay for the privilege to be able to access this forage that they have less control over the management, and forage that is in conflict sometimes with these other uses, right? And they pay for the privilege to be liable for the condition of that landscape. So it's a highly it's a high liability market from a rancher's perspective, but it's absolutely crucial for national food security and for the economics in the region. One thing I think that's important to remember is that more than 60% of the Western cattle herd and almost 50% of the national sheep herd spend some time on federal lands. And so when we're thinking about cattle production or sheep production in the Midwest, where you have those feeder states, or we think about the end stage product for the American consumer, it all ties back to these federal lands and the stability of what you find maybe in your high-end grocery store, right? That stability ties back to these federal lands too.
Well, you mentioned how important they are to the industry, whether it's cattle or sheep. And at CattleCon, we heard RFK Jr. speak, and did an amazing job describing the challenges that America faces with our food program and our nutrition programs. But at the end, he left us with please grow your herds, retain your heifers, grow your herds. We need more. We need a larger beef supply, so we don't have to import. And while that sounds great, there's a lot of issues that keep ranchers from expanding herds. Land being one of them. That's one of the reasons why the California Rangeland Trust and our port partners do to protect these lands, to keep the private lands in ranching. But having access to those federal lands is a big piece of that, whether those are existing allocated allotments or getting access to those vacant allotments. So I think that work that the PLC is doing to help us be a piece of this puzzle is so critical.
This is, I think, the unique push and pull of working with the federal government. I said earlier that everybody likes job security, and the federal government is no different. The federal government is always looking for ways to expand their influence and to be able to ensure an outcome. And, unfortunately for them and fortunately for us, I think in the federal lands grazing space, that's just simply not something that's been appropriate. And it's not something that's been welcome by the beef industry, by the sheep industry over time. We've talked a lot this last year about the size of the beef herd, what that means for consumer prices for beef products at the grocery store. Certainly, we have that same conversation with lamb as well. And the message that PLC has sent to the administration time after time is that there is a really appropriate way for the federal government to be involved in this conversation. It's to make sure that the forage that they own and are supposed to manage or facilitate management, make sure that that is able to be part of that food supply chain. Re-permit those vacant allotments. Make sure that they're up on the NEPA. Make sure that they have and can be good partners to ranchers, because it all comes back to certainty for producers. If ranchers in the West aren't certain that they're going to have access to forage, if they're facing this uncertainty in being able to transfer permits to the next generation, if they're concerned that all of their cows are going to be burned up in a wildfire because the forest conditions are poor, investment is going to be slow. We look at national herd retention, heifer retention this year. And I think we're starting to see signs that people are retaining heifers, that they are, keeping some animals back going into next year, which is a great sign for producer confidence. But it's absolutely crucial that these agencies deliver on their existing expectations without trying to ensure something else or expand their influence in other places. We in the federal land space, it's a little bit of push and pull, right? You have a really close relationship with the federal government because they are both your landlord, your land management partner, and also sort of the one who's chasing you with a carrot or a stick, depending on what that compliance situation looks like. It is absolutely crucial in my mind that we allow the market to determine what prices look like. It's crucial that we allow market-based conditions to inform consumer and producer choices. But removing uncertainty, especially unnecessary uncertainty in that area, is exactly where the federal government should be. Reduce uncertainty in the permitting process. Reduce uncertainty in access to forage. That's why PLC is working so hard with them to refine and revise BLM grazing regulations, to improve cooperative monitoring, to address those vacant allotments, to address those predator issues. All of those things are crucial in making sure that the federal government does their job and lets producers do theirs.
Well, a big part of getting to that success, particularly with our policymakers and the bureaucrats in our federal government, is telling the stories. And telling the stories not just to them, but to the public. And that is such a critical tool. I mean, not just on the public land side of things, but it's a critical tool for the industry as a whole. We constantly talk about and encourage our landowners to tell your story. And as an industry, we tend to be a little on the private side. But I think we're starting to see as the next generations come in, particularly with social media and other tools, they love to tell that story. And we see a real change to that. Now, we always have groups that thrive on and make money from opposition to grazing, particularly public lands grazing. Those aren't going to go away. That's a big industry there. But the general public, I think, has a different view. I know when we run and we're gathering, we're working out in the forest, we're running cattle, or not running, but we're moving cattle down the roads. Folks will stop and they'll take pictures and they want to talk and visit. And those multiple use folks out there, whether they're riding motorcycles or ATVs or hunting or out there fishing or just hiking, they really appreciate the value that the grazing provides. So if you look at it from those who are really stepping foot on those lands and enjoying them and being part of that multi-use environment, they appreciate that. Where do you see the value of telling those stories and trying to influence or educate, I should say, not influence, but educate the public in terms of the value of public lands ranching?
So PLC is a government affairs trade organization, right? My lens is working with lawmakers. My lens is working with agencies to make sure that the laws and the regulations and even the court decisions, right, match the management needs on the ground. This last Congress, last year in 2025, and I expect that we'll see that continue through the second session of the 119th, has been the friendliest Congress for grazing-related issues that I have seen during my more than a decade in Washington. And I attribute that, of course, to the quality of people who are in Congress, but to the campaigns that we and our affiliates have been working so hard on for the last however many years to be able to enshrine this idea that grazing is good, to be able to enshrine the idea that federal lands ranchers are a use, but they're also a management tool to make sure that hikers and bikers and horseback riders and photographers and fishermen and hunters and all of the rest can have access to healthy, productive lands. The public sentiment is hard, right? And if there's one good thing to come out of COVID, I think that it's that more people care about public lands, more people care about the landscape, and mostly they have a better understanding of what it takes to be a caretaker of these lands than they did before. Sure, we're still going to see people leave gates open. Sure, we're still going to have those multiple use conflicts. But that public understanding and that public engagement and support for public lands ranching is crucial, because those people aren't just people who might donate to the aunties or who might get on Facebook and have a challenge, and say, I don't understand why there are cows here. Those people, most of them, are voters. Those people are voting and telling their members of Congress what is on their mind and how they should vote on pieces of legislation. And so when you see members maybe bucking the party lines, when you see members step out and say, grazing is good and I want to help these ranchers, it's an understanding of their constituency, but an echo of that message back that we are making ground. We are gaining ground on this concept that grazing is good. And so I'm very encouraged about our trajectory, right? People want to eat beef. People want to eat lamb. People want wool over synthetic fiber. They want this industry to continue. And our job is to continue making sure that that's the case, but then also continue to educate them through all of our various partner groups that in order to have the steak, in order to have the wool socks, in order to have these areas where you can go and have a trail that maybe a rancher maintained, that you need a rancher to do that. It's not just a guy in a cowboy hat in an old Western. It's somebody who's living this every day with the science and the technology and the knowledge that the general public needs.
Any advice on how the ranching community can better tell that story?
A couple of years ago, I was in Idaho at a meeting, and this meeting was a little bit contentious, right? They were having, ranchers were having a lot of conflict issues with other multiple use groups at that time that had a big fire, and it really sort of brought a lot of issues to loggerheads. And this guy walked up to me. Had been, he was a rancher in his late 70s, had been at this quite a lot. He had been, had experienced a lot of challenges that year in the community. And he looked at me and he said, every opportunity is either to make a friend or an adversary. If you run into somebody on your allotment, you can either turn them into an enemy of federal lands grazing, or you can turn them into a friend. Always choose to make a friend. Social media is pervasive, right? And I think is an incredibly useful tool to be able to share your story. But I think also taking the opportunities like you did in the grocery store to say, no, it's actually good that we have rain because we need it to grow food. It's good that we have some fire, that there is a little bit of smoke, because it knocks down some of those fuels so that we don't have the big fires that will burn everybody's homes and forests. Taking those opportunities to educate when it might feel uncomfortable, when it might feel a little invasive, right? In your library or in line at the grocery store when you're filling up, right? Answer questions, be able to build that friend. You might never see that new friend again, but take the opportunity to explain what you do and why it's important to you. That human connection is, I think, one of the most effective pieces of advocacy that ranchers can do in their everyday life. You might not want to go to town, but when you're in town, put your game face on.
That is great advice. And we have one of our supporters said one time, if it hits one, that's one. And you never know what that one might be. And that one might just be the voice that makes the difference someday somewhere. Caitlin, where can folks learn more about the Public Lands Council?
So the Public Lands Council is on social media. We have Facebook, X, and Instagram. We love to share not only producer pictures and stories, but also some short reels that people can then share out to their respective communities. We have a website, publiclandscouncil.org. Where we share things like blog posts and opportunities to engage with legislation and regulation, but where we also share tools like our NEPA for Ranchers kit. We share updated science and information that PLC has contracted with various entities across the West. And we share other ways for producers and affiliates and friends to get involved and support federal lands ranching. There are a lot of different facets, right? Yes, we are a livestock related organization, but we partner with a lot of different land management interests. And our website is probably the best place to find that written down. But if you're a producer in the West, contact the Public Lands Council affiliate in your state. Reach out, figure out how you can be a friend to public lands ranchers and how your expertise can fit into that bigger.
Caitlin, thank you so much for all the work that the council does, that NCBA does, and the other affiliates that work on behalf of these public land ranchers across the West. Thank you for taking time from your busy schedule. I know you've been on the road a lot lately between Nashville and Monterey and other points in between, but we really appreciate you taking the time to visit with us and our listeners today. And I look forward to seeing you next week when I get to go back to the Capitol.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks for everything that you all do to continue to spread the word, to generate conversation, and to build a community of support for these issues.
We hope you enjoyed our conversation with Caitlin Glover. To find your local public lands grazing affiliate or learn more about the work of the Public Lands Council, visit publiclandscouncil.org. That closes a gate on another episode of Season 5 of Tuned Into the Land. As we continue into the season, we want to remind you that your feedback matters. So please share your thoughts by leaving a comment or a review. Let us know what you enjoyed, what topics you'd like us to dig into, and your suggestions for future guests. Don't forget to hit that follow button to ensure you're notified when the new episodes drop. And if you'd like to support our mission, visit our website at rangelandtrust.org. There you can make a donation or check out the Get Involved tab to learn more about upcoming events and conservation projects. Thank you for listening, and until next time.